So Donald Trump just strong-armed the one system he thought he could bully without consequence. And for the first time in his political life, he blinked. But here's the thing. The damage is already done. We are watching the complete collapse of a tough guy border strategy that was doomed from the start. The White House operated on the arrogant assumption that the Constitution would bend if he pushed hard enough. They banked everything on the idea that fear alone would force Congress to fold. But guess what? That gamble has backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. Instead of submission, Trump has been met with a wall of cold, hard competence. And it has exposed his operation as chaotic, unprepared, and completely out of its depth. It's honestly hard to believe he thought this would work. We are talking about a core institution, not a disposable pawn in one man's ego trip. This isn't just about a border headline. We are talking about the United States proving to the world that its word no longer means anything. Let me fill you in on what's been happening. So let's look at the setup here. Think about how deliberate this is. Trump didn't stumble into a border fight. He weaponized it. He turned the border into a multi-use political tool, not primarily to secure anything, but to expand executive control while daring the rest of the government to stop him. This is the part people keep missing because the noise is doing its job. A border story is perfect cover. It sounds urgent. It sounds emotional. It sounds like safety. And it gives Trump a magic phrase to keep repeating emergency. When you say emergency, you try to skip the part where Congress debates. When you say emergency, you try to skip the part where rules apply equally. When you say emergency, you try to skip the part where the Constitution tells you no. So the White House starts leaning on executive power like it's a battering ram. Not the normal process, not persuasion, not legislation, just executive muscle. And the calculation is simple. If institutions resist, Trump frames them as enemies of security. If they hesitate, Trump treats hesitation as permission. If they comply, Trump calls it proof he was right all along. That's why this never stays a policy debate. It becomes a stress test. How much can one man impose before the system snaps? How many boundaries can he blur before the public stops noticing the boundary existed? And this is where Hakeem Jeffries matters. Not because Jeffries is a superhero, but because Jeffries represents the one thing Trump hates most. A legislature that remembers it's supposed to be a legislature. A Congress that doesn't exist to clap for executive orders. A Congress that can say you don't get to rule by tantrum. Now Trump's loyalists want you to believe the only fight happening is partisan. That's the sales pitch. Democrats are attacking Trump because they hate him. No, the deeper fight is institutional. Executive power versus the branch that writes laws. And Trump is trying to win that fight by turning the border into an all-access pass. Here's the grievance statement Trump is selling to his base. The country is under threat. The border is out of control. The system is too slow. Therefore, only Trump can act. Therefore, anything Trump does is justified. Therefore, anyone who questions him is helping the threat. That's not governance. That's a hostage note. And look at the villain selection. Trump doesn't pick villains based on facts. He picks villains based on usefulness. Judges become villains when they block him. Congress becomes villains when it won't rubber stamp him. The press becomes villains when it describes what he's doing. And foreign partners become villains when he needs an external other to blame. Whether it was courts or Congress or career officials, the pattern is always the same. He demands personal loyalty. He treats legal limits as betrayal. He calls resistance sabotage. He turns the public against the referee. Then he claims the only fair outcome is the one where he wins. And that brings us to the pivot. Because this time, Trump didn't just build a border narrative. He built a border narrative that can be pointed anywhere. They knew he would come back. They knew he would be aggressive. And they built a strategy designed to neutralize his chaos with boring, relentless stability. That's what Trump can't stand. Stability is his kryptonite. Because stability exposes the con. A stable institution doesn't panic. A stable institution doesn't scream. It documents, it votes. It subpoenas, it litigates, it waits him out. And the moment you wait Trump out, you force him to face reality. He can't bully time. He can't executive order consequences away. So the bluff gets called. When Trump tries to use executive power in ways that look like they're replacing Congress, the question becomes unavoidable. Is this actually about security or is this about control? And once that question lands, the border storyline starts cracking. because control is the one thing Trump always wants more of, no matter what the topic is. And then comes the spillover. Because while Washington argues over authority, real people take the hit, not in slogans, in schedules, in paychecks, in contracts. A trucking company doesn't care about Trump's theatrics. It cares whether rules are stable from Monday to Friday. A manufacturer doesn't care about Trump's emergency posture. It cares whether shipments clear smoothly or get jammed by political theater. A family doesn't care about Trump's strongman fantasy. It cares whether prices jump because the government is improvising in public. This is where the border story turns into a power story, because the border is the lever, but the goal is the machine. At first glance, this looks like just another clash of personalities. But if you zoom out, a very specific pattern snaps into focus. Here's the first loop. The system offers a normal boundary. Work through Congress. Use the standard process. Justify your actions within the law. That's the good faith starting point. Then the boundary gets stated clearly. No, you cannot do that by decree. No, you do not get to substitute your will for legislation. Trump hears that boundary and reacts like a spoiled king hearing the word no. He escalates, he reframes, he smears, he tells his base the boundary itself is the enemy. And then comes the moral inversion, the part that poisons everything. The message was clear. Loyalty to Trump supersedes loyalty to the law. Here's the second loop. There's always a moment where people try to keep it polite. They try to treat Trump like a normal president. They speak carefully. They offer off-ramps. They assume he wants a workable outcome. Then they set a line. Stop using emergency language to skip Congress. Stop treating oversight like treason. Stop pretending your power is unlimited. Trump's response is never to negotiate. It's to destroy the legitimacy of the people who drew the line. He calls them weak. He calls them corrupt. He calls them enemies, and he tries to replace rules with personal dominance. The message was clear. Loyalty to Trump supersedes loyalty to the law. Here's the third loop. The public gets told this is about security, so the public expects results. Real security, clear outcomes, competence. Then the boundary appears. Again, institutions require transparency, accountability, and legal grounding. Trump can't tolerate that because transparency exposes his real aim. Accountability limits his freedom. Legal grounding forces him to explain himself like an adult. So he chooses spectacle. He chooses escalation. He chooses executive posture. And he tells the country the only thing that matters is whether you're with him. The message was clear. Loyalty to Trump supersedes loyalty to the law. Once you see this pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee. Anyone who refuses to cross the line is disposable. And that is the rule governing power inside Trump's world. Now watch what happens when you put Trump inside a no-win box, because that's where this story is headed, whether his supporters admit it or not. Trump's border strategy has two paths, and both are bad for him. That's not opinion. That's the structure of the trap he built. Option A is escalation. More executive power, more unilateral moves, more emergency language, more pressure on agencies to behave like personal enforcers, more public threats toward anyone who questions him. If he chooses that route, he invites lawsuits, institutional resistance, and a widening perception that he's using security as a costume for control. And here's the part that stings. The stronger he pushes, the more he proves the critics right. He turns oversight into a national confrontation. He turns governance into a dominance ritual. He turns the country into a stage where the only law is his mood. And that escalation has consequences that don't care about politics. Businesses hate uncertainty. Markets hate improvisation. Allies hate being treated like props. Investors hate the sense that the rules can be rewritten overnight by one man who can't stand limits. Let that sink in. Trump sells himself as the economic strongman, but strong economies are built on predictable institutions, not on executive adrenaline. Option B is retreat. He softens the emergency language. He backs away from the broad claims. He tries to make it look like he solved something quietly. But if he retreats, he loses the one thing his brand depends on, the illusion of unstoppable power. Because retreat makes it obvious the crisis was inflated. Retreat exposes the bluff. Retreat tells the country he pushed until he hit a wall and the wall held. So he's trapped. Escalate and look like a power-hungry authoritarian improvising in public. Retreat and look like a bully who got checked. And this is where Trump tries a classic move. He changes the target. If the southern border narrative starts drawing too much legal scrutiny, he widens the frame, he hints at new routes, new gaps, new loopholes, he drags in new characters to keep the drama going. And that's where Canada becomes useful. Canada is not the real story here. Canada is the prop Trump wants to carry into the scene to make his next move seem justified. He frames Canada as a northern gap, not because the facts demand it, but because the narrative benefits from it. It gives him an external scapegoat. It gives him a way to pretend the problem is bigger than his own choices. It gives him a way to pivot from constitutional limits into trade pressure without admitting he's changing the subject. So now, in Trump's storyline, the border isn't even just a border. It becomes a license to pressure trade, to pressure inspection regimes, to pressure cross-border movement of goods, to turn routine coordination into political theater. And that's exactly the kind of spillover that hits ordinary people first. A small exporter on either side of the line doesn't have a PR machine. A worker in a border town doesn't have a lobbyist. A family business doesn't have the luxury of waiting out Washington's chaos. They just feel the friction, they feel the slowdown, they feel the uncertainty, and they get told it's all for security when the real driver is power. Now zoom in on the political damage Trump is trying to cause on purpose. If Congress pushes back, Trump says, I acted in a crisis. If he gets sued, he says, they're suing me for protecting you. If oversight intensifies, he says, they're sabotaging security. He is always trying to move the argument away from legality and into emotion. Because legality is where he loses, and the goal is not just to win one fight. The goal is to train the public to normalize executive dominance, to make I alone can fix it feel like a reasonable stance instead of a red flag, to make Congress look slow, weak, and irrelevant, to make the idea of checks and balances feel like an obstacle instead of a safeguard. That's the real strategy. Not a wall, not a policy tweak, a cultural shift in what Americans accept from executive power. Here's how that shift gets built. First, he declares a crisis. Then he acts unilaterally. Then he dares the system to stop him. Then he tells his base, anyone who stops him is the enemy. Then he repeats it until the shock fades. That's why this story is so dangerous. Because the first time people panic, the second time people argue, the third time people shrug, and by the fourth time, it's just the way things are. Now, this is where the system starts striking back. Not with drama, with structure. A legislature asserts itself, not by yelling, but by demanding process, by reminding the country that emergency language does not erase the separation of powers, by making the question unavoidable, where did this authority come from and who approved it? And courts enter the picture the way they always do when someone tries to treat constitutional limits like optional guidelines. They don't care about Trump's vibe. They care about reasoning. They care about scope. They care about precedent. They care about whether crisis is being used as a shortcut around democratic governance. And when Trump's reasoning is, thin courts don't have to hate him to block him. They just have to do their job. That's the point. That's the problem. Trump has built a political identity around the idea that institutions are illegitimate unless they serve him. So when an institution behaves independently, he treats independence as betrayal. Now watch how Jeffries and Congress can weaponize that. They don't have to match Trump's volume. They just have to make him show his work. They just have to drag the improvisation into daylight. They just have to demand the paperwork, the rationale, the boundaries. And Trump hates that because paperwork is where performance collapses. And here's another twist that Trump can't control. When this becomes an executive versus legislature conflict, you start seeing fractures in places Trump depends on. Because the moment executive power looks unbounded, even some conservatives get nervous. Not because they suddenly became saints, but because they know a tool you normalize today can be used against you tomorrow. They know a precedent doesn't come with a MAGA-only license. They know the machinery outlives the man. So you get the quiet conservative turn. Former officials, legal conservatives, business-aligned Republicans, people who won't march in the anti-Trump parade, but also won't sign their name under a permanent expansion of executive dominance. And that matters because it breaks Trump's favorite defense. He loves to claim every check on him is just Democrats. When the pushback includes conservative skepticism, his narrative starts wobbling. Now bring Canada back into this, because the Canadian angle is where Trump tries to hide the ball. If he can convince his base that Canada is a loophole, he can reframe oversight as weakness. He can say Congress is blocking me while Canada is letting things through. He can imply betrayal without proving it, and then he can justify tightening trade friction as if it's border control. Notice what that does. It turns a constitutional dispute into international pressure. It turns domestic oversight into national strength. It turns a power grab into a defensive posture. And Canada's public safety minister becomes the perfect foil in this story. Not because Canada wants a fight, but because Canada as a sovereign partner can't just accept being painted as a criminal pipeline to make Trump feel powerful. Canada has to respond carefully. If Canada responds too loudly, Trump says, see, they're guilty. If Canada responds too quietly, Trump says, see, they're hiding something. So Canada does what competent governments do. They document, they coordinate, they keep the response procedural. They refuse to be dragged into reality TV diplomacy. And that's where Trump's tactic fails again, because his whole approach depends on panic. He needs opponents to flinch. He needs allies to beg. He needs institutions to freeze. When the response is calm and procedural, he looks unhinged. When the response is boring and competent, his chaos looks like chaos. Meanwhile, the domestic consequences keep stacking up, because even the perception of arbitrary enforcement can cause real effects. Companies delay decisions. Contracts get rewritten with more just-in-case clauses. Cross-border businesses start planning around uncertainty. Communities that rely on predictable movement feel the strain first. And this is how a power play becomes a pocketbook problem without ever needing a single dramatic headline. That's why emergency politics is so corrosive. It doesn't just change laws, it changes behavior. People adapt to instability. They pull back, they hoard, they hesitate. They stop trusting the future to be normal. Now we hit the long-term constitutional question that Trump is trying to bury under border imagery. Executive power is not supposed to expand because one man wants it. It's supposed to be constrained precisely because one man will always want more. So here's the frame shift. This is rules versus power. Let that sink in. Trump is not fighting for better rules. He's fighting for the right to override rules whenever it suits him. And once you accept that logic, you don't have a democracy. You have a strongman audition, and the warning is simple and it's not partisan. If you accept it once, it becomes precedent. If it becomes precedent, it doesn't disappear. If it doesn't disappear, someone else will use it. And when someone else uses it, you don't get to act surprised. That's the chain. That's how norms die. Not because people love tyranny, but because people get tired, distracted, and trained to accept shortcuts. Now zoom back to politics, because Trump is counting on a specific public reaction. He wants voters to reward his posture and ignore his incompetence. He wants the image of action to outweigh the reality of chaos. He wants people to confuse speed with strength. He wants people to confuse loudness with leadership. But the country has a different instinct when the consequences land. Voters punish chaos when it touches their lives. Voters reward stability when instability costs them money, time, and security. Not because voters are perfect, because voters are human. They don't want to live inside a constant manufactured emergency. And here's the final civilizational contrast that Trump keeps trying to erase. A serious nation runs on institutions, process, and restraint. A reality TV state runs on threats, villains, and executive tantrums. Trump wants the second because restraint humiliates him. Limits frustrate him, oversight insults him, and the idea that he can't just impose his will is the one thing he will never accept. So when this border story keeps surfacing, don't ask what's the policy. Ask the real question. What power is he trying to normalize? What boundary is he trying to erase? What check is he trying to make the public forget exists? Because the legal war is just beginning. The economic ripple is just starting to show up in daily life. And the political temperature is rising again, not because the border suddenly changed overnight, but because Trump is using it the way he always does, as a lever, as a weapon, as a test of whether the system will stop him.